I never imagined that my peaceful retirement dream would turn into a battlefield, but that's exactly what happened when an HOA Karen tried to steal my land. She marched in with fake maps, bogus rules, and a mansion that secretly sat on my property. They thought I'd roll over, but I've spent a career fighting liars like her. What followed wasn't just a neighborly dispute, it was a full-blown war of proof, power, and revenge that would end with her losing everything. Retirement was supposed to mean peace, but for me, it began as a restless dream. After 25 years as a federal land inspector, I had seen enough corruption, forged surveys, and shady developers to last 3 lifetimes. I promised myself that once I left the job, I'd find a corner of the country where no one could bother me, a place untouched by the endless shuffle of bureaucracy. So, when I discovered 9 acres of rugged hillside just outside of a little town in western Montana, I knew it was the sanctuary I'd been searching for. I went through every legal step with meticulous care. The land had belonged to an old timber company that folded years ago. I made sure the title was notarized, the surveys stamped and certified, and the coordinates checked not once but 3 separate times. If there was one thing I trusted in this world, it was documentation. I wasn't about to spend my life savings on a patch of paradise, only to have someone snatch it away on a technicality. Then I built my dream home, 2 stories of pine wood beams, a wide wraparound porch that caught the afternoon light, and a terrace where I could sip black coffee while storms rolled in across the mountain range. I wasn't looking for grandeur. I wanted solitude. No neighbors in sight, no HOA, no endless stream of letters telling me what shade of beige to paint my garage door. For the first time in decades, I felt free. Life settled into a rhythm. I spent my mornings in the workshop shaping juniper into furniture, the afternoons walking the ridge trails with my old shepherd Rusty. At night, coyotes howled in the distance, and the stars looked close enough to touch. That was the life I'd earned after years of fighting other people's battles over lines on a map. I thought I'd finally escaped it all. But peace never lasts long when money smells like opportunity. 2 years after I moved in, I noticed trucks carving out plots of land a few hundred yards down the ridge. Developers had arrived, and within months, an entire gated community began to rise. They called it Silver Creek Estates, as if slapping a fancy name on it would disguise the fact that they were cramming suburban sprawl into mountain country. I figured it wasn't my problem. Their boundary sat well away from mine, and I intended to keep to myself. The residents who trickled in at first were polite but distant. I'd see them at the hardware store trading stiff nods and tight smiles. I didn't mind. I wasn't there to join a neighborhood potluck. I just wanted to be left alone. But that illusion shattered the day she arrived. Her name was Veronica Kemp, though the locals quickly started whispering another name, Karen. She drove in with a gleaming platinum SUV, a perfectly groomed designer dog, and the air of someone who thought the whole world should follow her rules. She wasn't just another homeowner, she was the newly minted president of the Silver Creek Estates HOA. Her house was an overstuffed Mediterranean palace with fake columns and more solar panels than a tech campus, though from what I could tell, she never bothered to connect them. She built right up against the border of my land, close enough that her patio lights spilled across my ridge at night. At first, I thought nothing of it. People like her usually kept to their own kingdom. But then one morning, I found a gold-embossed envelope wedged into my gate. Inside was a typed letter requesting no demanding that I repaint my garage door to conform with neighborhood aesthetic codes. I laughed. It had to be a mistake. My land wasn't part of Silver Creek Estates. Their rules didn't apply to me. I tossed the letter in the fireplace. But that was only the beginning. Another letter followed this time about the excessive height of my workshop fence. Then one about my gravel driveway being inconsistent with visual uniformity standards. My personal favorite accused me of aesthetically jarring nocturnal pollution. In other words, I left my porch light on at night. Each letter was signed with her name, sometimes with a little heart dotting the I, like she thought it softened the blow of her arrogance. I ignored them all, but her campaign escalated. At the hardware store, I noticed residents whispering as I walked by. One family built a hedge so tall it blocked out their western view just so they wouldn't have to look at my home. It didn't matter that my house had been praised by the local Builders Guild for its craftsmanship. To them, I was the rogue element, the man who refused to play by their HOA's unwritten laws. And Veronica, she wasn't just irritated, she was plotting. I dealt with her type before, people who hid behind committees and regulations, convinced they had the right to dictate everyone else's lives. But I wasn't under her jurisdiction. I wasn't her subject. That didn't stop her from trying. One brisk morning, I spotted her standing inside my boundary line, clipboard in hand, snapping photos of my solar panels. When I stepped outside and told her she was trespassing, she simply smiled and said, "Just gathering information." Time we settled some things. That was when the unease set in. She wasn't just a nosy neighbor. She was laying the groundwork for something bigger, something official. My instincts, sharpened from decades in land disputes, screamed that this wasn't over. And I was right. A week later, I was in my workshop when tires crunched across my gravel drive. Out stepped Veronica wearing a tailored navy pantsuit and the smug smile of someone who thought she already won. Beside her stood a young man clutching a cheap leather briefcase. "You've been served," he said, handing me a packet thick with legalese. Inside was a violation summary, claiming that my garage and part of my workshop encroached on HOA property, her HOA's property. The evidence, a hand-drawn map that looked like someone mutilated Google Earth with a shaky mouse. Their demand was clear: demolish the structures or surrender the land amicably to the association. I stared at the papers, then back at her. She crossed her arms, smug as ever. "We're giving you a chance to resolve this peacefully," she said. I felt a cold anger settle in. They thought they could bully me, rewrite boundaries with crayons and lies. They had no idea who they were up against. My land was clean, my documents airtight, and I wasn't about to roll over. That was the moment I realized retirement was over. The war for my home had just begun. When that envelope landed in my hands, I knew I was staring at something more dangerous than a stack of pretentious HOA paperwork. It wasn't about paint colors or porch lights anymore. This was war by paper, the kind I had watched developers wage in federal hearings for decades. They always began the same way, with flimsy evidence dressed up in fancy words, hoping intimidation would do the heavy lifting. I spent the rest of that afternoon at my kitchen table, spreading the so-called violation summary across the wood grain. The hand-drawn map was almost comical, sloppy red lines cutting across terrain that bore little resemblance to reality. They claimed 24 feet of my garage, and a portion of my workshop roof protruded into HOA territory. The language sounded like my house was some kind of glacier creeping into their yard. Still, ridiculous or not, it was signed by a lawyer, which meant they intended to back it up. I didn't confront Veronica that day. People like her thrive on scenes, and I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction. Instead, I marched down to my workshop, dug into my filing cabinet, and pulled out the survey records I'd kept since the day I bought the property. Every page was notarized, GPS tagged, and stamped by the county engineer's office. I spent hours scanning them into cloud storage, making sure nothing could disappear accidentally. That night, as coyotes howled on the ridge, I sat by the fire with Rusty at my feet, the papers spread out before me, and made a vow. I would not bend. I would not surrender. If they wanted a fight over land, I was better armed than they could ever imagine. The very next morning, I called the county's land services department. When I explained what had happened, the clerk transferred me to a district engineer. He chuckled when I mentioned Veronica's name. "Oh, she's trying that again," he muttered. My stomach tightened. Again, before I could press for details, he changed tone and assured me they'd send someone to inspect if things escalated. That confirmed what I already suspected: Veronica had a history. She wasn't simply a concerned homeowner. She was a repeat offender in the business of pushing boundaries literally. Still, I wasn't going to rely on county bureaucracy to save me. Bureaucrats move slowly, and I knew Veronica was hoping exactly for that delay, confusion, intimidation. So I went to someone I trusted, Rocky Vista Geomatics, an independent survey firm staffed by ex-military and career professionals who didn't cut corners. I had worked with them years ago when I was still in the federal office, and I knew their readings were the kind you could walk into a courtroom with and watch a judge nod. I prepaid on the spot, requested a full GPS resurvey, and even added a drone-based LiDAR sweep. If Veronica wanted to play land games, I'd drag her into a technological battlefield she couldn't comprehend. 2 days later, just after sunrise, their trucks pulled into my driveway. Out climbed 3 surveyors in boots and windbreakers, each hauling tripods and gear. Their chief, a square-jawed man named Levi, shook my hand firmly but didn't waste words. These were professionals. They didn't care about HOA letters or suburban politics. They cared about measurements. I watched from my terrace as they moved along the southern edge of my property, hammering markers, aligning laser receivers, and checking the original pins buried years earlier. Hours passed. The sun shifted high overhead. Then Levi came knocking on my workshop door. "Mind coming out here?" he asked, his voice steady. He led me toward the slope that bordered Veronica's estate. There, hidden behind some ornamental shrubs, sat one of the original orange survey pins, flush with the ground, exactly where the 2020 record said it should be, verified within an inch. "So far so good," Levi muttered. Then he motioned for me to follow him downhill. He pulled back ivy along a rock wall and revealed another marker, but this one was wrong. 30 feet wrong. Someone had planted a counterfeit pin. Could be incompetence, Levi said, but more likely deliberate. He showed me his tablet. On it was a preliminary overlay, blue lines for my parcel, red for hers. And then the kicker, her backyard pool, her patio, even part of her guest house were bleeding over onto my land. Nearly a full acre. I stood frozen, staring at the screen. It wasn't just that she accused me falsely, she had built her empire on my soil. Levi tapped the marker with his boot. We'll have the certified report on your desk tomorrow. This one's not even close. That evening, as the crew packed up, I walked to my terrace and looked down at Veronica's glistening infinity pool. How many HOA parties had been held there, glasses of wine raised high, toasts, made deals closed, all of it built illegally on land she didn't own. Fury burned hot in my chest. I wasted no time. That night, I drafted my first motion, with the county clerk attaching my original survey, Levi's affidavit, and a formal encroachment dispute. At the same time, I filed cease and desist letters against both Veronica personally and the Silver Creek Estates HOA collectively. Copies went by certified mail, by email, and even hand-delivered by a courier I hired specifically for intimidation value. He wore sunglasses indoors and never smiled. By morning, the fuse had been lit. Veronica must have gotten the letters within hours, because at 5:00 p.m., Sharp, her lawyer, called me asking for a good-faith sit-down. I declined. Instead, I wrote a single sentence on the local community Facebook page. If you're going to accuse someone of building on your land, make sure your house isn't sitting on theirs. It exploded. Within minutes, comments poured in. Neighbors who had once avoided my gaze now demanded answers. Screenshots of Levi's overlay spread like wildfire. A teenager down the block uploaded drone footage showing her pool construction creeping across the line year after year like a time-lapse infection. By nightfall, the HOA had a full-blown rebellion on their hands. And Veronica, she had no idea that her obsession with control had just backfired. The war was no longer between her and me. It was between her and truth had momentum on its side. The following week was like standing in the eye of a storm calm on the surface, but I could feel the pressure building all around me. Veronica's letters stopped coming, but that silence didn't feel like surrender. It felt like plotting. And I wasn't wrong. Late one Tuesday afternoon, while sanding a piece of walnut in my workshop, I saw movement at the edge of my property line. I wiped the sawdust from my glasses and squinted. There she was, Veronica HOA clipboard queen herself, standing knee-deep in my land as if she owned the soil beneath her heels. She wasn't sneaking around either. She was bold, snapping photos of my solar panels, tapping something into her phone and muttering to the young man beside her. I stepped out onto the gravel, my voice steady but sharp. "You're trespassing." She didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled in that infuriating, practiced way of hers and chirped, "Oh, I'm just gathering information. Nothing personal." "For what exactly?" I asked, taking a few steps closer. Her eyes glittered. "Let's just say it's time we settled some things." That was all she gave me before strolling back toward her side of the ridge. Her little assistant, the kid with the briefcase, followed close behind like a duckling. My gut tightened. This wasn't idle neighborly harassment anymore. This was preparation. And sure enough, the very next morning the other boot dropped. I was turning a piece of juniper on the lathe when tires crunched on my driveway. Out I stepped, expecting a delivery truck. Instead, there stood Veronica, in a navy blue pantsuit, her arms folded smug as a cat who'd swallowed the canary. Beside her was the same young man, his suit 2 sizes too big, clutching a faux leather briefcase. "You Thomas Callahan?" he asked, already fumbling with a folder. "Yes." He pulled out a stack of papers and thrust them toward me. "You've been served." The words hit like a hammer, though I refused to let my face show it. I took the packet, flipped through the first few pages, and felt my blood boil. It wasn't just a warning this time. It was an official notice from the Silver Creek Estates HOA, filed through their so-called legal counsel. They alleged that part of my home, specifically the northwest corner of my garage and part of the workshop roof, encroached onto HOA property. They demanded I cease unauthorized occupation and either demolish the encroaching structures or submit a proposal for voluntary transfer of improvements to the association. In plain English, give us your land or we'll crush you. I looked up from the packet straight into Veronica's waiting smirk. "You think I built my home on someone else's property, not someone else's," she said sweetly. "The community's. And you've done your due diligence, verified your claims against official county records." Her assistant coughed nervously, but Veronica didn't miss a beat. "We conducted a thorough internal review," she replied, handing me a color printout of what could only be described as map vandalism, red lines scribbled across a pixelated satellite photo. Your landscape committee, I asked, my voice low. Our landscape committee determined the encroachment using updated visual estimation, she said, reciting the words like scripture. I let out a dry laugh, took one step forward and locked eyes with her. You've got 20 seconds to get off my property before I call the sheriff. Her smile tightened, but she didn't blink. We'll be following up shortly. You just did, I said, pointing to the road. Now walk. Her young lawyer shifted uncomfortably and started backing away, but Veronica lingered just long enough to throw one last parting shot over her shoulder. You'll regret making this difficult. I stood in my driveway long after they were gone, the papers crumpling in my fist. That phrase, you'll regret this, echoed in my ears. It wasn't just arrogance, it was a threat. That night, I pulled out the old filing cabinet from my utility room. Top drawer, third folder from the left, the original survey packet. Notarized. Time-stamped. Stamped by 2 separate agencies. GPS coordinates, elevation profiles, parcel boundaries, and overlays, signed off by the county itself 3 years before Silver Creek Estates even broke ground. My land was clean, airtight, ironclad. I spent hours photographing every page, uploading them to cloud storage, and even making hard copies to lock in a fireproof safe. If Veronica wanted a paper war, I was going to drown her in an ocean of legal truth. Still, I wasn't naive. Paperwork alone doesn't stop bullies, pressure does. So the next morning, I drove into town and walked straight into the county's land services department. I laid out the situation for the clerk, who listened with weary familiarity before transferring me to a district engineer. When I mentioned Veronica's name, he let out a low whistle. Karen, sorry Veronica, trying to annex property again, huh? Again, I repeated. There was a pause on the line. Then, with the quick shuffle of a man who had said too much, he cleared his throat and promised to send an inspector if necessary. That was all the confirmation I needed. She had a history of these stunts. And this time, she had picked the wrong target. I didn't wait for the county's wheels to turn. Bureaucracy is slow, lawsuits are slower. What I needed was cold, hard proof, and fast. That same day, I called Rocky Vista Geomatics, the most respected independent survey firm in the state. They agreed to a full GPS resurvey, complete with drone and LiDAR scans, starting within 72 hours. I prepaid on the spot and told them to prioritize the job. By the time I drove back up the ridge, I already had a plan forming in my mind. Veronica thought she could intimidate me with maps scribbled in Microsoft Paint. But I had professionals, technology, and the truth. When I got home, I found yet another letter wedged under my workshop door, this one filled with words like amicable resolution and avoidance of costly litigation. It ended with a highlighted sentence. This offer remains open for 48 hours. I laughed so hard, Rusty came running, tilting his head as if to ask what joke he'd missed. There would be no amicable resolution. Not this time. This wasn't about fences or porch lights anymore. This was about theft, deliberate, calculated theft. And I intended to make sure everyone knew it. The war had officially begun. 2 mornings later, just after the first streaks of daylight stretched across the ridge, the cavalry arrived. 3 white pickup trucks rumbled into my driveway, each one stenciled with the logo of Rocky Vista Geomatics. Out stepped a crew of hardened surveyors, boots caked in mud, windbreakers zipped against the mountain chill tripods, and GPS receivers slung over their shoulders like weapons. They didn't waste words, didn't gawk at the view, didn't bother asking for backstory. Professionals like that trusted the land more than testimony. I greeted them with black coffee and handed over a folder of my original documents. Levi, the crew chief, square-jawed, mid-40s, ex-military, by the look of him, took the folder, glanced at the first page, and handed it back. "We'll rely on our own readings," he said. Exactly what I wanted to hear. From my terrace, I watched them spread across the southern boundary, working with clinical precision. One man drove steel rods into the earth, another aligned laser tripods, while a third hovered over a tablet logging every coordinate. Rusty trotted at my heel ears, perked as if he sensed the tension. For hours I stood silent, the only sound the wind sweeping down the ridge and the faint clicks of survey equipment slicing the quiet. By mid-morning, Levi motioned for me. "Come take a look," he said. He led me to a slope bordering Veronica's estate. There, half hidden beneath ornamental shrubs, was a bright orange pin flush with the ground. He tapped it with his boot. Original 2020 marker, GPS verified within 1 inch. I felt my chest loosen slightly. At least one anchor point remained intact. But then Levi waved me downhill. He pulled aside a curtain of ivy clinging to a rock wall, and my stomach dropped. There was another marker jammed into the soil, but it was off. Way off. 30 feet from where it should have been. Whoever placed this one wasn't just careless, Levi muttered, crouching beside it. This was deliberate. He straightened and held up his tablet. The screen displayed an overlay, my boundaries in blue, Veronica's in red. The lines overlapped like an ugly wound, and there it was in plain numbers, her patio, her pool, her entire guest house bleeding into my parcel, almost a full acre stolen. I stared at the glowing screen until the edges blurred. My jaw clenched so hard I thought my teeth might crack. This wasn't a clerical mistake. It wasn't a neighborly misunderstanding. Veronica had knowingly, purposefully built her little empire on land that wasn't hers. Levi's voice cut through my haze. "We'll have the certified report on your desk by tomorrow. You're in the clear. She isn't." When the crew packed up, I stayed on the ridge, staring down at her sparkling infinity pool. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd accused me of encroachment, all while sipping wine and throwing HOA mixers on stolen soil. That night, as coyotes howled in the distance, I poured myself a heavy glass of bourbon and got to work. First stop the county clerk. I filed a motion for encroachment dispute, attaching every document I had, the original survey, Levi's preliminary report, sworn affidavits. Then I went further. I drafted cease and desist letters, one addressed to Veronica personally, the other to the entire Silver Creek Estates HOA board. I sent them certified mail, emailed copies, and for good measure hired a courier in a black suit to deliver hand copies. The man wore sunglasses indoors and said nothing. Sometimes intimidation is worth the extra fee. Within 24 hours, my phone buzzed with a call from Veronica's real lawyer, older, sharper, clearly brought in after her baby-faced intern fled the field. He asked if we could arrange a good-faith sit-down. I declined. Instead, I posted one simple line on the local Facebook community page. "If you're going to accuse someone of building on your land, make sure your house isn't built on theirs." By the time I finished my coffee, the post had gone viral, at least by small-town standards. Dozens of likes, comments multiplying by the minute. Someone leaked Levi's overlay map. Another posted side-by-side aerial photos showing Veronica's property growing like a cancer across my boundary year after year. And then came the kill shot, a teenager named Caleb, who lived 2 doors down from her uploaded drone footage time-lapse style that captured the entire pool expansion. You could literally watch the concrete creep across my line frame by frame, like an infection spreading. By sundown, Silver Creek Estates was in uproar. Neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid me were now pointing fingers at their HOA president. Whisper chains flew. Veronica had overstepped before she'd fast-tracked permits, she'd bullied contractors. My inbox lit up with anonymous tips, everything from shady deals to campaign donations. For the first time, I realized I wasn't alone in this fight. Veronica must have felt the tide turning because that weekend she staged her counterattack. Flyers went out inviting everyone in the HOA to a community solidarity barbecue. The location, the so-called shared recreation space at the rear boundary, except that space wasn't hers, it was mine. The very portion of land her pool, patio, and guest house sat on illegally. When Sunday rolled around, I watched from my porch as folding chairs sprouted across my ridge like weeds. Bluetooth speakers blared wine, coolers cracked open, and a realtor in pastel shorts handed out business cards near the grill. Veronica stood at the center of it all, champagne flute in hand, laughing too loud, making sure the cameras caught her smile. They were partying on stolen ground, staging theater for the neighborhood, trying to paint me as the outsider while she toasted to community. I didn't storm down there. I didn't scream or threaten. Instead, I set up my own cameras, recording every angle. Then I made one calm phone call to the sheriff's office and another to county code enforcement. "There's an unauthorized gathering on private property under active dispute," I explained. "Children are near an unpermitted pool. You'll want to see this." 40 minutes later, 2 patrol cars and a county inspector rolled up. By then, someone had already gone live on Facebook with a stream titled HOA vs. Landowner Grill Edition. It had over 1,000 viewers. I stood on my terrace, arms folded as the officers spoke to Veronica, then escorted her guests back across the property line. They cited county records, GPS coordinates, and issued her a formal trespass warning, all on camera. The party disbanded in embarrassed murmurs. A neighbor muttered, told her this was a bad idea. The live stream ended with Veronica scowling into the lens, muttering about fake maps and retaliation. She thought she could use spectacle to bury me. Instead, she had just handed me my best evidence yet public proof that she knew the land wasn't hers. That night, I sat by the fire, flipping through the footage on my laptop. I felt no triumph, no victory, just clarity. This was bigger than fences and pools. This was about power, arrogance, and the illusion of control. and I had just taken her mask off in front of everyone. But I also knew something else. People like Veronica don't back down after one loss. She would come harder, nastier, desperate, and I was ready. By Monday morning, it wasn't just my inbox that was burning, it was the entire town's rumor mill. The fallout from Veronica's barbecue debacle spread faster than wildfire in July. Everyone had seen the live stream, the sheriff escorting her off my property, the inspector citing GPS coordinates that proved her empire was built on lies. Silver Creek Estates, the pride of suburban exclusivity, now had a scarlet letter stamped across its gates: fraud. At the hardware store that morning, the cashier raised an eyebrow as I walked in. "Heard you gave the HOA a run for their money," she said, half whisper, half grin. Behind me, two contractors chuckled and muttered something about Karen's pool parties turning into crime scenes. The whole county was buzzing, and for once I wasn't the outcast hermit on the ridge. I was the man who stood up to the HOA queen and lived to tell about it. But I knew better than to celebrate early. Veronica wasn't the kind to retreat quietly. People like her doubled down. They'd rather torch the whole neighborhood than admit defeat. Sure enough, by Tuesday evening, I received a certified envelope, another formal notice from her attorney. This one threatened imminent litigation if I didn't remove my structures from community land. The irony almost made me laugh out loud. She had just been caught hosting a trespassing barbecue on my soil, and still she had the audacity to threaten me. Instead of replying, I uploaded the entire drone footage package to my cloud drive, linked it to my Facebook post, and let the town watch the truth unfold frame by frame. Within hours, people were commenting things like, "So her pool's basically on stolen ground," and "Wait, does that mean my HOA fees paid for this mess?" The HOA message board, which someone kindly forwarded me screenshots of, had descended into chaos. Half the residents demanded answers. The other half wanted her gone. That's when I received an unexpected knock at my door. It was Greg Porter, a retired dentist who'd been one of the first residents of Silver Creek. He stood there in a flannel shirt, his eyes full of unease. "She's calling an emergency HOA meeting," he told me. "Says we need to defend our borders." "Borders?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. Greg sighed, looking tired. "Not everyone's with her, you know. Just watch your back." I thanked him, but the warning gnawed at me. If Veronica was rallying her troops, I couldn't afford to let my guard down. That night, I checked every camera along my property line twice. The footage from the barbecue had given me leverage, but it also painted a target on my back. Sure enough, Sunday rolled around with another one of Veronica's grand gestures. This time, she posted an open invitation to a community unity picnic again on the disputed land. The audacity was breathtaking. She actually printed banners, hired a local catering service, and set up rental tents right where her illegal guest house straddled my acreage. It was theater, pure and simple. A last-ditch attempt to spin the narrative before it slipped entirely from her control. I didn't confront her. I didn't even walk down the slope. Instead, I let the cameras roll while neighbors milled about under the tents, sipping wine and avoiding eye contact. But this time I didn't just call the sheriff. I went bigger. That night I drafted a formal petition to the county planning and zoning department. I worded it carefully, each sentence sharp enough to draw blood, but polite enough to avoid claims of hostility. I requested a comprehensive review of all structures within Silver Creek Estates, citing recent revelations of boundary mismanagement and potential unpermitted construction. The bureaucratic grenade landed 3 days later. The county announced random inspections across the entire HOA. Deck permits, drainage, compliance, zoning variances, all of it was now under scrutiny. I didn't need to swing a hammer. Veronica had just dragged her entire neighborhood into a regulatory nightmare. The HOA message board erupted again. Rumors flew like hornets from a kicked nest. One homeowner worried their deck wasn't up to code. Another whispered that Veronica had expedited permits for friends in exchange for campaign donations. Then came the real kicker news, leaked that Veronica was planning to run for the County Land Advisory Council. She hadn't just been bullying neighbors for fun, she was laying the groundwork for a political career. Her grand picnic had become her Waterloo. Instead of a show of strength, it turned into a public relations implosion. By the following week, whispers turned into open defiance. Residents who once followed her blindly now demanded her resignation. Even her allies grew quiet, and through it all I sat on my porch with Rusty sipping iced tea, watching the storm gather on her horizon. But the real reckoning came when the courthouse doors swung open. The hearing wasn't a dramatic Hollywood trial. It was modern, suburban justice, quieter but just as devastating. Journalists in cheap suits filled the benches. HOA members clustered in the back row whispering behind sunglasses. A couple of interns from the zoning office typed notes like stenographers. I walked in wearing jeans, a blazer, and the calm expression of a man who knew every fact was on his side. Veronica strutted in moments later, her white blazer pressed, her hair sprayed into submission, her chin lifted like she was auditioning for a reality show. But her lawyer's eyes told a different story. He already looked like a man preparing to lose. The judge, a stern woman with no patience for theatrics, summarized the matter. Plaintiff alleges encroachment. Defendant counterclaims structural violations. Evidence includes surveys, drone footage, and permit records. Her lawyer went first, painting it all as a regrettable misunderstanding, blaming inconsistent developer maps, downplaying the trespassing barbecue as a community misunderstanding. He even suggested my actions filing with zoning posting online were disproportionate. Then it was my turn. I didn't grandstand. I simply laid the documents on the table: certified surveys, GPS overlays, drone footage showing her pool creeping across the boundary like an invasive species. Then I played the live stream of her barbecue guests sipping wine on land the county had confirmed wasn't hers. Finally, I presented the bombshell: an affidavit from the county inspector stating that her guest house was registered as a tool shed, her patio had never been permitted, and her pool permit had been pushed through under false pretenses. The room went silent. Even her own neighbors shifted uncomfortably. Then came the voicemail. A neighbor had forwarded it to me, a message from Veronica herself, her voice dripping with arrogance. "If we just keep pressure on him, he'll cave. That land's not even worth much to him. He's just being difficult." The judge overruled her lawyer's objection, saying the voicemail spoke directly to intent. In that moment, the mask slipped. Veronica wasn't a victim of faulty maps or messy surveys. She was a fraud, plain and simple, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. The tide had turned. The silence in that courtroom after the voicemail played could have swallowed the world whole. You could feel the weight of the words drop onto Veronica's shoulders like a lead vest, and for the first time since this saga began, her smug mask cracked. Not much, just a flicker in her jaw, but enough for everyone to see. The neighbors who had come to support her leaned back, whispering, their confidence faltering. I sat there with my hands folded, the calmest man in the room, because I knew that moment had just gutted her case. But the judge wasn't done. She invited the county inspector to take the stand. Under oath, the inspector confirmed every suspicion I'd had. Veronica's guest house was on the books as a tool shed. The sprawling patio, no permit filed. The infinity pool. The permit had been processed only on the assumption that it sat entirely within HOA property lines. And when asked about who authorized such sloppy documentation, the inspector explained that the approving officer had recently resigned. The courtroom buzzed like a disturbed hive. Then the judge asked the question that mattered most. Did the defendant have access to the official county survey before filing her claim against the plaintiff? My lawyer leaned forward, smiling like a man about to win a hand of cards. "Yes, Your Honor. Records show the HOA requested access to the official survey months before the complaint was filed. Mrs. Kemp had it in her possession. That was the kill shot." The judge leaned back, tapping her pen against the bench, then delivered her verdict with a swiftness that left no room for misinterpretation. Veronica had knowingly filed false claims, built illegal structures on private land, and attempted to coerce me into surrendering property under fabricated evidence. The court found her in bad faith. The order was brutal. Within 30 days, she was to vacate the encroaching structures, pay damages amounting to $820, 0,000, including land value, loss of use, and punitive fines, and submit herself and the entire HOA to a full audit of permits and approvals. To ensure compliance, the court appointed an independent land auditor to oversee the HOA, stripping Veronica of her unchecked power. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A few of her neighbors looked like they'd just witnessed their empire collapse. One HOA board member slumped so low in his chair I thought he might slide under the bench. Veronica, meanwhile, sat stone-faced, eyes forward, lips pressed into a bloodless line. When the gavel fell, I exhaled for the first time in months. Outside, the courthouse reporters swarmed, microphones shoved in my face. I gave them a single line: I just wanted to be left alone. Now I just want my land back. But the battle wasn't over. The 30-day deadline came and went without a dime of payment. Veronica's lawyer filed a motion for delay, citing financial hardship and pending appeals. The judge denied it in 48 hours flat. So I did what the law allowed me to do. I filed for enforcement. Montana property law is clear: if a structure is built illegally on someone else's land and the violator cannot pay restitution, ownership of those structures can be transferred to the rightful landowner. In other words, her mansion, her pool, her patio, all of it could become mine. The process took weeks of paperwork and inspections. County officers walked the perimeter with me, clipboards in hand, noting every square foot of Veronica's empire that sat squarely on my land. They weren't sympathetic to her cause. The evidence was too damning. One officer shook his head as we passed the pool. She thought she could get away with this. I simply nodded. She thought she could bluff. 6 weeks later, the final transfer order came through. I stood at the edge of her once proud mansion, pen in hand, and signed the document that sealed her fate. The land had always been mine. Now the house sitting on it was too. The lockbox came off the front door, and the county updated the title. I wish I could say I felt triumph, but the truth was stranger. Standing in the grand entryway of her Mediterranean monstrosity, staring up at the gaudy chandelier, I didn't feel victorious. I felt empty. This wasn't a home. It was a stage set. Every column, every tile, reeked of arrogance. It wasn't a prize, it was a monument to her hubris. That's when an idea began to take root. I called an old friend, Jack Alvarez, a retired Navy medic who now ran a nonprofit for veterans transitioning back into civilian life. We'd talked for years about creating a place where guys could decompress, not a clinic, not a halfway house, just somewhere real. Now I had space. Too much of it. Together, we gutted the mansion of its pretentious furniture and tasteless decor. We stripped out the marble countertops, ripped down the pergolas, and repurposed the pool deck into a rooftop garden. The guest house became a woodworking and welding studio. The bedrooms were converted into private quarters for veterans. And the infinity pool. We drained it, covered it, and transformed the area into a fire pit and community gathering space. Opening day wasn't covered by the press. There were no ribbon cuttings, no speeches, just 5 veterans arriving quietly with duffel bags, looking around as if unsure they belonged. That night, they sat around the fire pit swapping stories under the stars, and for the first time in years, I felt my land being used for something that mattered. Of course, the HOA tried to protest. A letter arrived claiming the new Veteran Transition Center violated neighborhood aesthetic consistency. I responded with a scanned copy of the court judgment and a sticky note, aesthetic this. They never followed up. Something strange happened after that. A few of the same neighbors who once scowled at me from behind hedges began sending gift baskets. One even stopped by in person, admitting she was glad the property was finally serving a purpose beyond ego. Slowly, the hostility thawed. Silver Creek was still Silver Creek, but the iron grip of Veronica's rule had been broken. As for Veronica, she vanished. Word trickled through the grapevine that the state had revoked her real estate license after the audit uncovered a laundry list of ethical violations. No scandal, no headlines, just erasure. And me. For the first time since this nightmare began, I could sit on my porch with Rusty at my feet, sip black coffee, and watch the sun bleed across the ridge without feeling the weight of her shadow. The war was over, but the land was finally mine again. Or so I thought. Because as I would soon learn, people like Veronica rarely accept defeat quietly. And her story with me wasn't quite finished. Peace never lasts long when you've just humiliated someone like Veronica. For a few weeks, it felt like the nightmare had ended, neighbors softening toward me, the veterans settling into their new routines, the HOA board too busy scrambling through audits to bother me. But beneath the calm, I knew she was plotting something. People like her didn't fade into obscurity quietly. They waited, seethed, and struck when the world had stopped watching. The first sign came not from her directly, but from whispers. At the local diner, I overheard 2 men talking about lawsuits piling up again. At the post office, a clerk warned me she'd tried sending multiple certified letters to my address. Most never reached me, probably because the county had already flagged her attempts as frivolous. Still, it was proof that Veronica was clawing at the walls, refusing to accept the new reality. Then one brisk March afternoon, a silver sedan pulled into my driveway. Out stepped Veronica herself, but she was hardly recognizable. The once meticulously dressed HOA president now looked thin, her shoulders hunched under an oversized coat, sunglasses too large for her pale face. She stood by the gate, silent, staring at the house that had once been her stage. I didn't move toward her. Rusty barked low and steady, but I held him back. She didn't wave, didn't speak, just stood there for a moment before turning and driving away. I thought that was her goodbye, her final act of retreat. But I was wrong. 2 weeks later, the county sheriff delivered papers to my door. Veronica had filed an appeal claiming financial ruin, emotional distress, and alleging that the entire trial had been biased due to community hostility against her. Her argument was a patchwork quilt of excuses, but still it was enough to drag me back into legal limbo. My lawyer laughed when he read the complaint. "This won't stick," he said, "but it will waste your time." And that was exactly the point. Veronica wasn't trying to win. She was trying to bleed me dry with delays, hoping I'd fold out of exhaustion. But I didn't. Instead, I doubled down. I gathered every scrap of documentation, emails, video footage, the inspector's testimony, and compiled them into a dossier so airtight you could drop it from a plane and it wouldn't tear. At the same time, I filed a counter-motion requesting that her frivolous appeal be sanctioned. If she wanted to play legal chicken, I'd make sure she paid for every mile. Word of the appeal spread quickly. Once again, Silver Creek residents turned on her. This time, it wasn't just grumbling on message boards, it was open revolt. One homeowner marched into the county zoning office to confess his deck hadn't been permitted properly, blaming Veronica for fast-tracking the paperwork. Another admitted she'd pressured him into donating to her campaign fund in exchange for promised HOA favors. Piece by piece, her empire of lies crumbled, and this time there was no one left to shield her. The appellate court dismissed her case within 6 weeks, calling it without merit. But by then, the damage to her reputation was permanent. The local newspaper ran a front-page story titled, "HOA President Loses, It All Mansion License and Community Trust." Even people outside the county knew her name now, not as a leader but as a cautionary tale. And yet, even in defeat, Veronica managed one last act of spite. Before vanishing from Silver Creek, she filed dozens of nuisance complaints, with the county targeting everything from unpermitted veteran housing to excessive noise at my property. Each one was investigated. Each one came back clean. But the constant knock of inspectors at my door was a reminder she was still trying to haunt me. By summer, word spread that Veronica had moved out of state. Some said she went to live with her sister in Nevada. Others claimed she was hiding in Florida, reinventing herself under a different name. Whatever the truth, she was gone from the Ridge. Silver Creek held new elections. The HOA board turned over completely, and audits forced them to operate with transparency for the first time in years. Life finally settled into something resembling peace. The veterans flourished, some learning new trades in the workshop, others finding the quiet healing they'd been desperate for. Neighbors who once kept their distance now brought pies offered to mow the Ridge, or simply stopped by to talk. The Ridge was no longer a battlefield. It was a community, one forged not by HOA rules, but by resilience and survival. And yet I couldn't help but keep a wary eye on the horizon. Every time a car slowed near my gate, every time an unfamiliar envelope landed in my mailbox, my chest tightened. Veronica had taught me a brutal lesson. Even one determined person, armed with nothing but arrogance and a clipboard, could turn peace into war. Still, when autumn came and the first snow dusted the Ridge, I found myself standing on my terrace with Rusty at my feet, coffee in hand, staring out at the mountains. The land was mine. The house was mine. The peace, hard-earned and scarred, was mine. And somewhere out there I hoped Veronica had finally learned what the Ridge had taught me long ago. You can't fake ownership, not with papers, not with power, and not with lies. The land always remembers who it belongs to. When the final snows of winter melted into streams rushing down the hillside, I thought I had finally reached the quiet I had dreamed of years earlier. The veterans who had moved into the center thrived. Jack, my old Navy buddy, transformed the once gaudy living room into a warm, common hall lined with shelves of books and maps. The kitchen, once designed to impress HOA board luncheons, now churned out pots of chili and loaves of bread for men and women who hadn't felt the warmth of home in years. The place pulsed with life, real life. Not the fake shine of Veronica's exclusive community, but something earned, something raw and healing. And for me, it felt like redemption. For years, I had fought to protect what was mine, my land, my name, my sanity. Now that battle had turned into something larger, a legacy that mattered beyond my own property lines. But even in peace, I couldn't shake the lessons the war had branded into me. One lesson stood above all bullies: thrive when good people stay silent. Veronica's power had never come from her own strength. It came from the silence of neighbors, too timid to resist, too fearful of standing against her. For years they had swallowed her rules, signed her papers, and let her dictate their lives in the name of aesthetic harmony. Only when the truth spilled out on cameras in courtrooms in front of the entire county did they find the courage to admit they had been wrong. That silence almost cost me everything. So I speak now not as a man who won a battle, but as someone who lived through it. If there's a message in my story, it's this: know your ground, stand firm, and never assume peace will protect itself. Whether it's a plot of land, a job, a relationship, or your dignity, if it's worth having, it's worth defending. The law can be twisted, papers can be forged, neighbors can be manipulated, but facts, real facts, have a way of cutting through the noise if you're willing to fight for them. And another truth revenge, sweet as it felt in the courtroom, wasn't the endgame. The real victory came when I turned her mansion of lies into a sanctuary of hope. I could have sold the house, gutted it, or left it to rot as a trophy of my win. Instead, it became a fire pit where scarred veterans laughed again, a workshop where broken hands built new things, a garden where life grew from the soil she had stolen. Sometimes the best revenge is to build something better on the ruins your enemy left behind. As for Veronica, her shadow still lingers in whispers. Some say she's tried restarting her career in another state. Others claim she's vanished completely, stripped of titles, broken, bitter. I don't care where she ended up. The Ridge remembers, the county remembers. And if she ever tried to claw her way back into this valley, she'd find no one willing to listen anymore. Now, when I sit on my terrace with Rusty at my feet and the mountains stretched out before me, I finally feel the peace I fought so hard to keep. The kind of peace that isn't given, it's earned through blood, sweat papers, and persistence. And I'll say this to anyone listening, don't ever underestimate the power of standing your ground, even when the odds feel stacked against you. Don't assume bullies can't be beaten. And don't think for a second that silence will protect you, because it won't. If my story taught you anything, let it be this: the truth matters. And when the truth is on your side, no HOA, no Karen, and no mountain of lies can take it away from you. So now I'll turn it over to you. Have you ever faced someone like Veronica, someone who tried to take what was yours, someone who abused rules to bully others? Share your stories in the comments below. I read them, every one. And if you believe stories like this should be told, subscribe to the channel. Because, trust me, this isn't the last time a Karen will try to rewrite the rules, and together we'll be ready for the next battle.